Letter A, growth and diffusion of industrialization. Number 1, compare the British agricultural revolution with the Industrial Revolution. The agricultural revolution produced a surplus of displaced agricultural workers who then provided labor for factories in the Industrial Revolution. So both of these were looking at new types of jobs, per se, and they were both looking at industrializing and modernizing countries. Number 2, describe Wallerstein's core periphery model. I'm going to be brief. You can go back to your notes, but remember the core are the more developed countries, like the United States. The periphery are your less developed countries, like most of sub-Saharan Africa. And your semi-periphery are your newly industrialized countries, like many Latin American nations. Remember this, Wallerstein's core periphery model was developed by people who supported Marxism because it talks about the subjugation of the poor by the capitalist, more developed countries. Number 3, in the 15th and 16th centuries, how did the core countries have an advantage? When did the modern network of global economic interdependence and competition begin? Subjugate and colonize peripheral and semi-peripheral countries. That's what a lot of this is revolving around, is the subjugation and the colonization of the peripheral and semi-peripheral countries by the core countries. When European nations began exploring outside of their continent in the 1600s, that's when global economic interdependence and competition began, during this colonization era. And there were different waves, like the North American wave by the Europeans, and then East Asia, and then African. But it was that beginning of colonization in the 1600s when this competition really took off. Number 4, describe the dependency theory. LDCs depend on MDCs, and they can't get out. Again, it's compared to Marxism. Dependency theory, Wallerstein's core periphery model, is a dependency theory. Number 5, according to the dependency theory, why is poverty allowed to exist? Poverty is allowed to exist because this allows an elite class to control all of the economic resources and control which direction their government or economy is going to go. And so you've got a major group subjugating or controlling a lesser group. The elite class is controlling everything from the periphery. Number 6, define cottage industry. Just manufacturing that takes place in homes. Number 7, describe maquiladoras and their location. These were factories in Mexico that developed because of NAFTA. Because of NAFTA, United States and Canadian companies were able to locate in Mexico for their cheap labor. And the maquiladoras exist along the Mexico and United States border today. Number 8, what is the Rust Belt and where is it? This is a manufacturing center in the United States that is no longer in operation. It's in the northern region around Detroit, Buffalo, and Cleveland. Number 9, describe break-in-bulk point. This is a vocabulary word. It's a place, such as a port or rail yard, where goods are transferred from one mode of transportation, divided, and then sent on another transport system. So your break in bulk is when you take your bulk of your transport, the goods you're transporting, and then break it up and send it different directions on different types of transportation. Number 10, which mode of transportation is characterized by low terminal cost, high line cost, and high route flexibility? This is your truck transportation. This is the transportation that you're going to see on your medium distances when looking at transportation methods. Letter B, social and economic measures of development. Number 1, define GNP or GDP, literacy rate, life expectancy, R&I, and HDI, and then describe their influence on development. GNP is gross national product, GDP is gross domestic product, and they're very similar. They're measuring pretty much the same thing. They're measuring goods and services that a country brings in a year. You add per capita to that, and you get per person. You're looking at more of an average of how much money you're making. Literacy rate is the percentage of people that can read or write. You want both the GDP and literacy rate to be high. And what I mean by high is above 30,000 GDP is going to be more developed. Your literacy rate above 90%, you're going to be more developed. Life expectancy, you want to live longer, and above 75, 80 is going to be your more developed. Your rate of natural increase, or your RNI, remember back to the demographic transition model, you actually want this number low. You don't want a population increase nowadays. And then HDI, Human Development Index. This measures both economic production and social indicators to determine how developed a country is. And you get a decimal with 3 numbers beside that decimal on that HDI. Generally, countries like the United States are around a 0.921, which is really good. That's more of your more developed. Number 2, define standard of living. Standard of living is the measure of wealth and life enjoyment that a person holds. Kind of like the HDI, it is looking at economic production, but it's also looking at social things. Number 5, something we've kind of skipped over, define the Gini coefficient. This measures the income disparity between the wealthiest and the poorest population groups in a country. Might need to go back and look at that a little bit because we didn't cover it in detail. Define, looking at number 4, first world, second world, third world, fourth world and fifth world countries, and provide a real-world example of each. First world refers to the so-called developed, capitalistic, industrial countries. Generally, the United States and their allies during World War II are your first world countries. North America, Western Europe, Japan, and Australia. Second world countries refer to the former communist socialist industrial states, formerly the Eastern Bloc, the territory and sphere of the influence of the Soviet Union. Today, Cuba is a good example of this, but also a lot of Eastern European nations and some of the Turk states like Kazakhstan, as well as China, fit into your second world countries. Third world countries are all the other countries. Today, often used to roughly describe the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Some examples: Venezuela, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Mali are all going to be referred to as your third world countries. Your fourth world countries. This term refers to nations, cultures, cultural entities, and ethnic groups of indigenous people living within or across state boundaries. A good example of this is in Canada. In the province of Nunavut is a good example of this type of country. And then a fifth world country is describing a country that lacks a formal government. Western Sahara has a boundary, but they don't really have a formal government because it's mainly the nomadic Berber peoples there. I don't know about you, but Scooby-Doo just makes me happy. I've always wanted a Great Dane, and that's kind of the breed of dog he's representing. So I thought I'd include him here. Letter C, contemporary patterns and impacts of industrialization and development. Number 1, describe renewable energy and give examples. Renewable energy is energy that can be used now, but it's also looking at preserving that energy for the future. Some examples of this would be like solar energy, wind energy. Natural gas is not an example of renewable energy. Number 2, define deglomeration. Deglomeration occurs when a location is saturated with businesses offering similar services, and so these industries relocate to other spots where they won't be surrounded. So the conglomeration will be deglomerated. Number 3, define deindustrialization. Deindustrialization occurred at the national level in Great Britain when heavy industry was moved to locations with lower production costs. And so a lot of these manufacturing centers are now focused on more of the tertiary or quaternary economic activities, like the Rust Belt or the United States as a whole, really. We're deindustrializing at a rapid rate. You don't have a whole lot of manufacturing centers anymore because we're outsourcing those jobs. Number 4, describe Alfred Weber's least cost theory. This theory accounted for the location of a manufacturing plant in terms of the owner's desire to minimize 3 categories of cost: transportation, labor, and agglomeration. One thing to remember is that it does not take into effect consumer demand for the finished product. Number 5, define a free trade zone. In a free trade zone, the normal trade laws of a country, such as tariffs, bureaucratic requirements, and quotas, are eliminated in hopes of stimulating foreign trade and industry. China has free trade zones and economic activity zones where they allow capitalist adventures to take place, and the communist government does not punish them because they like that money. Number 6, define ecotourism. Ecotourism is tourism that revolves around conserving or protecting the environment. A good example of ecotourism is national parks. You're preserving the environment and you're also making money off of it. Number 7, define e-commerce. E-commerce is essentially business conducted online, and I do a lot of e-commerce. Number 8, define a footloose industry. Hopefully this rings a bell with my beautiful singing, and if you get the urge to go back and listen to it, go for it. I'm thinking about copywriting those notes so that I could sell them on iTunes. I'll let you know if that happens. But a footloose industry is an industry that does not have to be located next to the raw material or market. For example, your computer processing, the electronic plates that are developed that go into computers, hard drives in Eastern Asian countries is a good example of a footloose industry. Number 9, what did the Asian economic crisis in the 1990s trigger in Asian countries, which called for more of a focus on tertiary and quaternary economic activities? This triggered deindustrialization, and they focus on not having a lot of manufacturing centers, but more tertiary and quaternary economic activities. Number 10, label the 4 Asian tigers. And you might see it in your test called the 4 old Asian tigers. Old and new, they're the same. That's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. Number 11, describe the primary industrial regions and their locations. This is where industrialization has consistently been the number one economic activity. North America, Russia and Ukraine, Western Europe, and East Asia are good examples of this. Remember, North America, it's pretty much in the northeast. However, we are developing the Sun Belt, which is growing as an industrial center.